Lord of the Rings, Chapter 3. Is that frontwards or backwards? I'll have to check that afterwards. Chapter 3. 3 is company. You ought to go quietly, and you ought to go soon, said Gandalf. 2 or 3 weeks had passed, and still Frodo made no sign of getting ready to go. I know, but it is difficult to do both, he objected. If I just vanish like Bilbo, the tale will be all over the Shire in no time. Well, of course you mustn't vanish, said Gandalf. That wouldn't do at all. I said soon, not instantly. If you can think of any way of slipping away out of the Shire without it being generally known, it would be worth a little delay. But you must not delay too long. What about the autumn? On or after our birthday? Asked Frodo. I think I could probably make some arrangements by then. To tell the truth, Frodo was very reluctant to start. Now that it had come to the point, Bag End seemed a more desirable residence than it had for years, and he wanted to savor as much as he could of his last summer in the Shire. When autumn came, he knew that part, at least of his heart, would think more kindly of journeying, as it always did at that season. He had indeed privately made up his mind to leave on his 50th birthday, Bilbo's 128th. It seemed somehow the proper day on which to set out and follow him. Following Bilbo was uppermost in his mind, and the one thing that made the thought of leaving bearable. He thought as little as possible about the ring and where it might lead him in the end, but he did not tell all of his thoughts to Gandalf. What the wizard guessed was always difficult to tell. He looked at Frodo, and he smiled. Very well, he said. I think that will do, but it must not be any later. I am getting very anxious. In the meanwhile, do take care. Don't let out any hint of where you are going, and see that Sam Gamgee does not talk. If he does, I shall really turn him into a toad. As for where I am going, said Frodo, it would be difficult to give that away, as I have no clear idea myself. Yet, don't be absurd, said Gandalf. I'm not warning you against leaving an address at the post office, but you are leaving the Shire. That should not be known until you are far away, and you must go, or at least set out, either north, south, west, or east, and the direction certainly should not be known. I have been so taken up with thoughts of leaving Bag End and of saying farewell that I've never even considered the direction, said Frodo. For where am I to go? And by what shall I steer? What is to be my quest? Bilbo went to find a treasure there and back again. But I cannot lose one. I go to lose one, and not return as far as I can see. But you cannot see very far, said Gandalf. Neither can I. It may be your task to find the cracks of doom, or that quest may be for others. I do not know. At any rate, you are not ready for that long road yet. No, indeed, said Frodo. But in the meantime, what course am I to take? Towards danger, but not too rashly, nor too straight, answered the wizard. If you want my advice, make for Rivendell. That journey should not prove too perilous, though the road is less easy than it was, and it will grow worse as the year fails. Rivendell, said Frodo. Very good. I will go east. I will make for Rivendell. I will take Sam to visit the elves. He'll be delighted. He spoke lightly, but his heart was moved suddenly with a desire to see the house of Elrond half-Elven, and to breathe the air of the deep valley where many of the fair folk still dwelt in peace. One summer's evening, an astonishing piece of news reached Ivy Bush and Green Dragon. Giants and other portents on the borders of the Shire were forgotten for more important matters. Mr. Frodo was selling Bag End. Indeed, he had already sold it To the Sackville Bagginses. For a nice bit, too, said some. And at a bargain price, said others. It's more likely when Mistress Lobelius, the buyer, Otho, had died some years before, at the ripe but disappointed age of 102. Just why Mr. Frodo was selling his beautiful hole was even more debatable than the price. A few held the theory, supported by the nods and hints of Mr. Baggins himself, that Frodo's money was running out. He was going to leave Hobbiton and live in a quiet way on the proceeds of the sale down in Buckland among the Brandybuck relatives. As far from the Sackville Bagginses as may be, some added, but so firmly fixed had the notion of immeasurable wealth of the Bagginses of Bag End become that most found this hard to believe. Harder than for any other reason or unreason that their fancy could suggest. To most, it suggested a dark, unrevealed plot of Gandalf. Though he kept himself very quiet and did not go about by day, it was well known he was hiding up there in Bag End. But however a removal might fit in with the designs of his wizardry, there was no doubt about the fact. Frodo Baggins was going back to Buckland. Yes, I shall be moving this autumn, he said. Mary Brandybuck is looking for a nice little hole for me, perhaps a small house. As a matter of fact, with Mary's help, he had already chosen and bought a little house in Crick Hollow in the country beyond Bucklebury. To all but Sam, he pretended he was going to settle down there permanently. The decision to set out eastwards had suggested an idea to him. Buckland was on the eastern border of the Shire, and he had lived there in childhood. His going back would at least seem credible. Gandalf stayed in the Shire for over 2 months. Then one evening at the end of June, soon after Frodo's plan had been finally arranged, he suddenly announced that he was going off again next morning. Only for a short while, I hope, he said. But I am going down beyond the southern borders to get some news, if I can. I have been idle longer than I should. He spoke lightly, but it seemed to Frodo that he looked rather worried. Has anything happened? He asked. Well, no. But I have heard something that has made me anxious, and it needs looking into. If I think it necessary, after all, for you to get off at once, I shall come back immediately, or at least send word. In the meanwhile, stick to your plan, and be more careful than ever, especially of the ring. Let me impress upon you once more, don't use it. He went off at dawn. I may be back any day, he said. At the very latest, I shall come back to your farewell party. I think, after all, you may need company on the road. At first, Frodo was a good deal disturbed, and wondered often what Gandalf could have heard. But his uneasiness wore off, and in the fine weather, he forgot his troubles for a while. The Shire had seldom seen so fair a summer, or so rich an autumn. The trees were laden with apples, honey was dripping from the combs, corn was tall and full. Autumn was well underway before Frodo began to worry about Gandalf again. September was passing, and there was still no news of him. The birthday and the removal drew nearer, and still he did not come, or send word. Bag End began to be busy. Some of Frodo's friends came to stay and to help him with packing. There was Fredegar Bolger and Folkel Boffin, and of course his special friends, Pip and Took and Mary Brandybuck. Between them, they turned the whole place upside down. On September 20th, 2 covered carts went off, laden to Buckland, conveying the furniture and goods that Frodo had not sold to his new home by way of the Brandywine Bridge. The next day, Frodo became really anxious and kept a constant lookout for Gandalf. Thursday, his birthday morning, dawned, as fair and clear as it had long ago for Bilbo's great party. Still, Gandalf did not appear. In the evening, Frodo gave his farewell feast. It was quite small, just a dinner, really, for himself and his 4 helpers, but he was troubled. and he felt in no mood for it. The thought that he would soon have to part with his young friends weighed on his heart, and he wondered how he was going to break it to them. The four younger hobbits, however, were in high spirits, and the party soon became very cheerful, in spite of Gandalf's absence. The dining room was bare, except for the table and chairs, but the food was good, and there was been included in the sale to the Sackville Bagginses. Whatever happens to the rest of my stuff when the SBs get their claws on it, at any rate, I found some good home for this, said Frodo, and he drained his glass. It was the last drop of Old Wynyards. When they had sung many songs and talked of many things which they had done together, they toasted Bilbo's birthday, and they drank his health, and Frodo's, together according to Frodo's custom. Then they went out for a sniff of air, a glimpse of the stars, and then they went to bed. Frodo's party was over. Gandalf had not come. The next morning, they were busy packing another cart with the remainder of the luggage. Merry took charge of this and drove off with Fatty, that is, Fredegar Bolgor. Someone must get there and warm the house before you arrive, said Merry. We'll see you later, the day after tomorrow, if you don't go to sleep on the way. Volko went home after lunch, but Pippin remained behind. Frodo was restless and anxious, listening in vain for sounds of Gandalf. He decided to wait until nightfall. After that, if Gandalf wanted him urgently, he would have to go to Crick Hollow, and might even get there first, for Frodo was going on foot. His plan, for pleasure and for a last look at the Shire, as much as for any other reason, was to walk from Hobbiton to Buckleberry Ferry, taking it fairly easy. And I shall get myself a bit of training, too, he said, looking at himself in the dusty mirror in the half-empty hallway. He had not done any strenuous walking for a long time, and the reflection looked rather flabby, he thought. After lunch, the Sackville Bagginses, Lobelia, and her sandy-haired son Lotho turned up, much to Frodo's annoyance. Ours at last, said Lobelia as she stepped inside. It was not polite, nor strictly true, for the sale of Bag End did not take effect until midnight. But Lobelia can perhaps be forgiven. She had been obliged to wait about 77 years longer for Bag End than she once hoped, and she was now 100 years old. Anyway, she had come to see that nothing that she had paid for had been carried off, and she wanted the keys. It took a long while to satisfy her, as she had brought a complete inventory with her and went right through it. In the end, she departed with Lotho and the spare key, and the promise that the other key would be left at the Gamgees in Bagshot Row. She snorted, and showed plainly what she thought of the Gamgees, that they were capable of plundering the whole during the night. Frodo did not offer her any tea. He took his own tea with Pippin and Sam Gamgee in the kitchen. It had been officially announced that Sam was coming to Buckland to do for Mr. Frodo and look after his bit of the garden, an arrangement which was approved by the gaffer, though it did not console him for the prospect of having Lobelia as his neighbor. Our last meal at Bag End, said Frodo, pushing back his chair. They left the washing up for Lobelia. Pippin and Sam strapped up their 3 packs and pitched them in the porch. Pippin went out for a last stroll through the garden. Sam disappeared. The sun went down. Bag End seemed sad and gloomy and disheveled. Frodo wandered around the familiar rooms and saw the light of the sunset fading along the wall and shadows creeping out of the corners. It grew slowly dark indoors. He went out, and he walked down to the gate at the bottom of the path, and then on a short way down the hill road. He half expected to see Gandalf come striding up through the dusk. The sky was clear, the stars were growing bright. It's going to be a fine night, he said aloud. That's good for a beginning. I feel like walking. I can't bear any more hanging about. I am going to start, and Gandalf must follow me. He turned to go back, and then stopped, for he heard voices, just around the corner, by the end of Bagshot Row. One voice was certainly that of the old gaffer. The other was strange, and somehow unpleasant. He could not make out what it said, but he heard the gaffer's answers, and they were rather shrill. The old man seemed to put out. No, Mr. Baggins has gone away. Went this morning. And my Sam went with him. Anyway, all his stuff went. Yes, sold out and gone, I tell you. Why? Why, it's none of my business or yours. Where to? Well, that ain't no secret. He's moved to Buckleberry or some such place, way down yonder. Yes, it is. A tidy way. Well, I've never been so far myself. They're queer folks in Buckland. No, I can't give no message. Good night to you. And footsteps went away down the hill. Frodo wondered vaguely why the fact that they did not come on up the hill seemed like a great relief. I am sick of questions and curiosity about my doings, I suppose, he thought. What an inquisitive lot they all are. And he had half a mind to go ask the gaffer who the inquirer was. But he thought better or worse of it, and turned and walked quickly back to Bag End. Pippin was sitting on his pack in the porch. Sam was not there. Frodo stepped inside the dark door. Sam, he called. Sam, time. Coming, sir, came the answer from far within, and followed soon by Sam himself, wiping his mouth. He had just been saying farewell to the beer barrel down in the cellar. All aboard, Sam? Yes, sir. I'll ask for a bit now, sir. Frodo shut and locked the round door and gave the key to Sam. Run down with us to your home, Sam, he said. Then cut along the row and meet us as quick as you can at the gate in the lane beyond the meadow. We are not going through the village tonight. Too many ears pricking and eyes prying. Sam ran off at full speed. Now we are off at last, said Frodo. They shouldered their packs and took up their sticks and walked around the corner to the west side of Bag End. Goodbye, said Frodo, looking at the dark, blank windows. He waved his hand and then turned, and following Bilbo, if he had known, hurried after Peregrine down the garden path. They jumped up over the low place in the hedge at the bottom and took across the field, passing into the darkness like a rustle through the grass. At the bottom of the hill, on its west side, they came to the gate opening onto the narrow lane. There they halted and adjusted the straps on their packs. Presently, Sam appeared, trotting quickly and breathing hard. His heavy pack was hoisted high on his shoulders, and he had put on his head a tall, shapeless felt bag, which he called a hat. In the gloom, he looked very much like a dwarf. I'm sure you've given me all the heaviest stuff, said Frodo. I pity snails and all that carry their homes on their backs. Well, I can take a lot more yet, sir. My pack's quite light, said Sam stoutly and untruthfully. Oh. No, you don't, Sam, said Pippin. It's good for him. He's got nothing except what he ordered us to pack. He's been slack lately, and he'll feel the weight less once he's walked off for some of his own. Be kind to a poor old hobbit, laughed Frodo. I shall be as thin as a willow-wind, I am sure, before I get to Buckland. But I was talking nonsense, and I suspected you've taken more than your share, Sam. I shall look into it at our next packing. He picked up his stick again. Well, we all like walking in the dark, he said. So let's put some miles behind us before bed. For a short while, they followed the lane westward. Then, leaving it, they turned left and took quietly to the fields again. They went in single file along the hedgerow and the borders of coppices, and the night fell dark about them. In their dark cloaks, They were as invisible as if they had had magic rings. Since they were all hobbits, and they were trying to be silent, they made no noise, even that hobbits would hear. Even the wild things in the fields and the woods hardly noticed their passing. After some time, they crossed the water west of Hobbiton by a narrow plank bridge. The stream was there no more than a winding black ribbon bordered by leaning alder trees. A mile or two further south, they hastily crossed the great road from the Brandywine Bridge. They were now in Tookland. And bending southeastwards, they made for the Green Hill country. As they began to climb the first slopes, they looked back and saw the lamps of Hobbiton far off, twinkling in the gentle valley of the water. Soon it disappeared into the folds of the darkened land, and was followed by Bywater beside its gray pool. When the light of the last farm was far behind, peeping amongst the trees, Frodo turned and waved a hand in farewell. "I wonder if I shall ever look down into that valley again," he said quietly. When they had walked for about 3 hours, they rested. The night was clear, cool, and starry, but smoke-like wisps of mist were creeping up the hillsides from the stream and the deep meadows. Thin-clad birches, swaying in the light wind above their heads, made a black net over the pale sky. They ate a very frugal supper for hobbits, and then they went on again. Soon they struck a narrow road that went rolling up and down, fading gray into the darkness ahead. The road to Woodhall and Stock, and then the Buckleberry Ferry. It climbed away from the main road in the water valley and wound over the skirts of the green hills towards Woody End, a wild corner of the East Farthing. After a while, they plunged into a deeply cloven track between tall trees and rustled their dry leaves. Trees that rustled their dry leaves in the night. It was very dark. At first, they talked, or hummed a tune softly together, being now far away from inquisitive ears. Then they marched on in silence, and Pippin began to lag behind. At last, as they began to climb a steep slope, he stopped and yawned. "I am so sleepy," he said, "and soon I shall fall down on the road. Are you going to sleep on your legs? It is nearly midnight." "Well, I thought you liked walking in the dark," said Frodo. "But there is no great hurry. Mary expects us some day the day after tomorrow. That leaves us nearly 2 days more. We will halt at the first likely spot." "The wind is in the west," said Sam. "If we get to the other side of this hill, we shall find a spot that's sheltered and snug enough, sir. There is dry fir wood just ahead, if I remember rightly." Sam knew this land well, all the land within 20 miles of Hobbiton, but that was the limit of his geography. Just over the top of the hill, they came to this patch of fir wood. Leaving the road, they went into the deep, resin-scented darkness of the trees and gathered dead sticks and cones to make a fire. Soon they had a merry crackle of flame at the foot of a large fir tree, and they sat round it for a while until they began to nod. Then, each in an angle of the great tree's roots, they curled up in their cloaks and blankets and were soon fast asleep. They set no watch. Even Frodo feared no danger yet, for they were still in the heart of the Shire. A few creatures came and looked at them when the fire died away. A fox, passing through the wood on business of his own, stopped for several minutes and sniffed them. "Hobbits," he thought. "What's next? I've heard of strange doings in the land, but I've seldom heard of hobbits sleeping outdoors under a tree. 3 of them. There's something mighty queer about this." And he was right, but he never found out any more about it. The morning came, pale and clammy. Frodo woke up first and found that the tree root had made a hole in his back and that his neck was stiff. "Walking for pleasure? Why didn't I drive?" he thought, as he usually did at the beginning of an expedition. and all my beautiful feather beds sold to Sackville Bagginses. These tree roots would do them good. He stretched. Wake up, hobbits, he cried. It's a beautiful morning. What is beautiful about it? Said Pippin, peering over the edge of his blanket with one eye. Sam, get breakfast ready for 9:30. And do you have my bathwater hot? Sam jumped up, looking rather bleary-eyed. No, sir, I haven't, sir, he said. Frodo stripped the blankets from Pippin and rolled him over, and then walked over to the edge of the wood. Away eastward, the sun was rising out of the mist that lay thick across the world. Touched with gold and red and autumn trees, everything seemed to be sailing rootless in a shadowy sea. A little below him, to the left, the road ran steeply into a hollow and disappeared. When he returned, Sam and Pippin had got a good fire going. Water! Shouted Pippin. Where's the water? Well, I don't keep any water in my pockets, said Frodo. We thought you went to find some, said Pippin, busy setting out food and cups. Well, you had better go now. Well, you can come too, said Frodo, and bring all the water bottles. There was a stream at the foot of the hill. They filled their bottles at the small camping kettle in a little fall where the water fell a few feet over an outcrop of gray stone. It was icy cold, and they spluttered and puffed as they bathed their faces and hands. When their breakfast was over and their packs were trussed up again, it was after 10 o'clock, and the day was beginning to turn fine and hot. They went down the slope and crossed the stream where it dived under the road, and up the next slope, and up and down another shoulder of hills. And by that time, their cloaks, blankets, water, food, and other gear already seemed like a heavy burden. The day's march promised to be warm and tiring work. After some miles, however, the road ceased to roll up and down. It climbed to the top of a steep bank in a weary, zigzaggy sort of way, and then prepared to go down for the last time. In front of them, they saw the lower land dotted with small clumps of trees which melted away into the distance to a brown woodland haze. They were looking across the woody end towards the Brandywine River. The road wound away before them like a piece of string. The road goes on forever, said Pippin. But I can't without a rest. It's high time for lunch. And he sat down on the bank at the side of the road and looked away east into the haze, beyond which lay the river, and the end of the Shire, in which he had spent all of his life. Sam stood by him. His round eyes were wide open, for he was looking across lands that he had never seen to a new horizon. Do elves live in those woods? He asked. Not that I've ever heard, said Pippin. Frodo was silent. He too was gazing eastward along the road, as if he had never seen it before. Suddenly he spoke, aloud, but as if to himself, saying slowly, The road goes ever on and on, down from the door where it began. Now far ahead the road has gone, and I must follow, if I can, pursuing it with weary feet, until it joins some larger way, where many paths and errands meet, and whither then, I cannot say. That sounds like a bit of old Bilbo's rhyming, said Pippin. Or is it one of your imitations? It does not sound altogether encouraging. Oh, I don't know, said Frodo. It came to me then, as if I was making it up, but it may be that I have heard it long ago. Certainly it reminds me very much of Bilbo in his last years before he went away. He used often to say there was only one road, but it was like a great river, whose very springs were at every doorstep, and every path was only a tributary. It's a dangerous business, Frodo, going out your door, he used to say. You step onto the road, and if you don't keep your feet, there is no knowing where you might be swept off to. Do you realize that it is this very path that goes through Mirkwood, and that if you let it, it might take you to the lonely mountain, or even further, and to worse places. He used to say that on the path outside the front door of Bag End, especially after he'd been out for a long walk. Well, the road won't sweep me anywhere for at least an hour, said Pippin, unslinging his pack. The others followed his example, putting their packs against the bank and their legs out into the road. After a rest and a good lunch, and then some more rest. After a rest, they had a good lunch and then some more rest. The sun was beginning to get low, and the light of afternoon was on the land as they went down the hill. So far, they had not met a soul on the road. This way was not much used, being hardly fit for carts, and there was little traffic to Woody End. They had been jogging along again for an hour or more when Sam stopped for a moment as if he was listening. They were now on level ground, and the road, after much winding, lay straight ahead, through grass sprinkled with tall trees, outliers of the approaching woodlands. I can hear a pony or a horse coming along the road behind, said Sam. They looked back, but the turn of the road prevented them from seeing very far. Well, I wonder if that's Gandalf coming after us, said Frodo. But even as he said it, he had a feeling it was not so, and a sudden desire to hide from the view of the rider coming over him. It may not matter much, he said apologetically, but I would rather not be seen on the road by anyone. I am sick of my doings being noticed and discussed, and if it is Gandalf, he added, as an afterthought, we can give him a little surprise and pay him out for being so late. Let's get out of sight. The other two ran quickly to the left and down into a little hollow not far from the road, and there lay flat. Frodo hesitated for a second, curiosity or some other feeling struggling with his desire to hide. The sound of hooves drew nearer. Just in time, he threw himself down in a patch of long grass behind a tree that overshadowed the road. Then he lifted his head and peered cautiously over one of the great roots. Around the corner came a black horse, no hobbit pony, but a full-sized horse, and on it sat a large man who seemed to crouch in the saddle, wrapped in a great black cloak and hood so that only his boots in his high stirrups showed below. His face was shadowed and invisible. When it reached the tree and was level with Frodo, the horse stopped. The riding figure sat quite still, with his head bowed, as if listening. From inside the hood came a noise, as if someone sniffed to catch an elusive scent. The head turned from side to side of the road. A sudden, unreasoning fear of discovery laid hold of Frodo, and he thought of his ring. He hardly dared breathe, yet the desire to get it out of his pocket became so strong that he began slowly to move his hand. He felt he had only to slip it on, then he would be safe. The advice of Gandalf seemed absurd. Bilbo had used the ring. And I'm still in the Shire, he thought, as his hand touched the chain on which it hung. At that moment, the rider sat up, shook the reins, and the horse stepped forward, walking slowly at first, then breaking into a quick trot. Frodo crawled to the edge of the road and watched the rider until he dwindled into the distance. He could not quite be sure, but it seemed to him that suddenly, before passing out of sight, the horse turned aside and went into the trees on the right. Well, I call that very queer and indeed disturbing, said Frodo to himself as he walked towards his companions. Pippin and Sam had remained flat in the grass and had seen nothing, so Frodo described the rider and his strange behavior. I can't say why, but I felt certain that he was looking or smelling for me. And also I felt certain that I did not want him to discover me. I've never seen or felt anything like it in the Shire before. But what has one of the big people got to do with us? Said Pippin. And what is he doing in this part of the world? There are some men about, said Frodo. Down in the South Farthing, they've had trouble with big people, I believe. But I've never heard of anything like this rider. I wonder where he comes from. Begging your pardon, put Sam in suddenly. I know where he comes from. It's from Hobbiton that this here Black Rider comes. Unless there's more than one. And I know where he's going too. What do you mean? Asked Frodo sharply, looking at him in astonishment. Why didn't you speak up before? Well, I've only just remembered it. It was like this. When I got back to our hole yesterday evening with the key, my daddy says to me, Hello, Sam, he says. I thought you were going away with Mr. Frodo this morning. There's been some strange customer asking for Mr. Baggins a bag end, and he's only just gone. I've sent him on to Buckleberry. Not that I really liked the sound of him. He seemed mighty put out when I told him Mr. Baggins had left his old home for good. Hissed at me, he did. Gave me quite a shudder. What sort of fellow was he? I says to me gaffer. Well, I don't know, says he, but he weren't no hobbit. He was tall and black-like, and he stooped over me. I reckoned he was one of the big folk from foreign parts. He spoke funny. Well, I couldn't stay to hear more, sir, since you were waiting, and I didn't give much heed to it myself. The gaffer is getting old and more than a bit blind, and it must have been near dark when this fellow came up the hill and found him taking in the air at the end of our row. I hope he hasn't done no harm, sir, nor me. Well, the gaffer can't be blamed anyway, said Frodo. As a matter of fact, I heard him talking to the stranger, who seemed to be inquiring for me. I nearly went and asked him who he was, and I wished I had, or that you had told me about it before. I might have been more careful on the road. Still, there may be no connection between this rider and the gaffer's stranger, said Pippin. We left Hobbiton secretly enough. I don't see how he could have followed us. But what about the smelling, sir? Said Sam. And the gaffer said it was a black chap. Now I wish I would have waited for Gandalf, Frodo said. But perhaps it would have only made matters worse. Then you know or guess something about this rider, said Pippin, who caught him muttering to himself. Oh, I don't know, and I would rather not guess, said Frodo. All right, Cousin Frodo. You can keep your secret for the present, if you want to be mysterious. In the meanwhile, what are we to do? I should like a bite and a sup, but somehow I think we had better move on from here. Your talk about sniffing riders and invisible noses has unsettled me. Yes, I think we should move on now, said Frodo, but not on the road, in case that rider comes back or another follows him. We ought to do a good step more today. Buckland is still miles away. The shadows of the trees were long and thin on the grass as they started off again, and they now kept a stone's throw to the left of the road, keeping out of sight of it as much as they could. But this hindered them, for the grass was thick and tussocky, and the ground was uneven. They began to draw together into thickets. The trees began to draw together into thickets. The sun had gone down red behind the hills at their backs, and evening was coming on before they came back onto the road at the end of the long level over which it had been running straight for some miles. At that point, it bent left and went down into the lowlands of the Yale, making for Stock. But a lane branched off to the right, winding through a wood of ancient oak trees on its way to Wood Hall. This is the way for us, said Frodo. Not far from the road meeting, they came to the huge hulk of a tree. It was still alive and had leaves on the small branches that it had put out round the broken stump of its long fallen limbs, but it was hollow and could be entered by a great crack in the side away from the road. The hobbits crept inside and sat there upon a floor of old leaves and decayed wood. They rested. They had a light meal. They talked quietly, listening from time to time. Twilight was about them as they crept back out to the lane. The west wind was sighing in the branches. Leaves were whispering. Soon the road began to fall gently but steadily into the dusk. A star came out above the trees in the darkening east before them. They went abreast and in step to keep up their spirits. After a time, the stars grew thicker and brighter, and the feeling of disquiet left them, and they no longer listened for the sound of hooves. They began to hum softly, as hobbits have a way of doing as they walk along, especially when they are drawing near to home at night. With most hobbits, it's a supper song or a bed song, but these hobbits hummed a walking song, though not, of course, without any mention of supper or bed. Bilbo Baggins had made the words to a tune that was as old as the hills, and taught it to Frodo as they walked in the lanes of the Water Valley and talked about adventure. Upon the hearth the fire is red, beneath the roof there is a bed, and not to weary our feet, still round the corner way we meet. A sudden tree, or standing stone, that none have seen but we alone. Tree and flower, leaf and grass, let them pass, let them pass. Hill and water under sky, pass them by, pass them by. Still round the corner there may wait a new road or secret gate. And though we pass them by today, tomorrow we might come this way and take the hidden paths that run toward the moon or to the sun. Apple, thorn, and nut and sloe, let them go, let them go. Sand and stone and pool and dell, fare you well, fare you well. Home is behind, the world ahead, and there are many paths to tread, through shadows in the edge of night, until the stars are all alight. Then world behind and home ahead, we'll wander back to home and bed. Mist and twilight, cloud and shade, away shall fade, away shall fade. Fire and lamp and meat and bread, and then to bed, and then to bed. The song ended. And now to bed, and now to bed, sang Pippin in a high voice. Hush, said Frodo. I think I hear hooves again. They stopped suddenly, and they stood as silent as tree shadows. They were listening. There was a sound of hooves on the lane, some way behind, but coming, slow and clear in the wind. Quickly and quietly, they slipped off the path and ran into the deeper shade under the oak trees. Don't let us go too far, said Frodo. I don't want to be seen, but I want to see if it's another Black Rider. Very well, said Pippin, but don't forget the sniffing. The hooves drew nearer. They had no time to find any hiding place better than the general darkness under the trees. Sam and Pippin crouched behind a large tree bole, while Frodo crept back a few yards towards the lane. It showed, gray and pale, a line of fading light through the wood. Above it, the stars were thick in the dim sky, but there was no moon. The sound of hooves stopped. As Frodo watched, he saw something dark pass through the lighter space between the two trees, and then halt. It looked like a black shade of a horse, led by a small black shadow. The black shadow stood close to the point where they had left the path. It swayed from side to side, side to side. Frodo thought he heard the sound of snuffling. The shadow bent to the ground and then began to crawl towards him. Once more, the desire to slip the ring on came over Frodo. But this time it was stronger than before. So strong that almost before he realized what he was doing, his hand was groping in his pocket. But at that moment, there came a sound, like mingled song and laughter, clear voices that rose and fell in the starlit air. The black shadow straightened up and retreated. It climbed on to the shadowy horse and seemed to vanish again, across the lane into the darkness on the other side. Frodo breathed again. Elves! Exclaimed Sam in a hoarse whisper. Elves, sir! He would have burst out of the trees and dashed towards the voices if they had not pulled him back. Yes, it is elves, said Frodo. One can meet them sometimes in the woody end. They don't live in the Shire, but they wander into it in the spring and autumn, out of their own lands, way beyond the Tower Hills. I'm thankful they do. You did not see, but that black rider stopped just here and was actually crawling towards us when their song began. As soon as he heard the voices, he slipped away. But what about the elves? Said Sam, too excited to trouble about the rider. Can't we go and see them? Listen, they're coming this way, said Frodo. We only have to wait. The singing drew near. One clear voice rose now above the others. It was singing in the fair elven tongue of which Frodo knew only a little, and the others knew nothing. Yet the sound blended with a melody seeming to shape itself in their thought into the words which they only partly understood, and this was the song, as Frodo heard it. Snow White, O lady clear, a queen beyond the western sea, O light to us that wander here, amid the world of woven tree. Gilthoniel, O Elbereth, clear are thy eyes and bright thy breath. Snow White, we sing to thee, in a far land beyond the sea. O stars that in the sunless year with shining hand are here by her were sown. In windy fields now bright and clear, we see your silver blossom blown. O Elbereth, Gilthoniel, we still remember, we who dwell in this land beneath the trees, thy starlight on the western seas. The song ended. These are high elves. They spoke the name of Elbereth, said Frodo in amazement. Few of that fairest folk are ever seen in the Shire. Not many now remain in Middle-earth, east of the great sea. This is indeed a strange chance. The hobbits sat in shadow by the wayside. Before long, the elves came down the lane toward the valley. They passed slowly, and the hobbits could see the starlight glimmering in their hair and in their eyes. They bore no lights, yet as they walked, a shimmer, like the light of the moon above the rim of the hills before it rises, seemed to fall around their feet. They were now silent, and as the last elf passed, he turned, and he looked towards the hobbits, and he laughed. Hail, Frodo! He cried. You are abroad late. Or are you perhaps lost? And he called aloud to the others, and all the company stopped and gathered round. It is indeed wonderful, they said. 3 hobbits in a wood at night. We have not seen such a thing since Bilbo went away. What is the meaning of it? The meaning of it, fair people, said Frodo, is simply that we seem to be going the same way that you are. I like walking under the stars, but I would welcome your company. We have no need of other company, and hobbits are so dull, they laughed. And how do you know we are going the same way as you? You do not know whither we are going. And how do you know my name? Asked Frodo in return. We know many things, they said. We have seen you often before with Bilbo, though you may not have seen us. Who are you? And who is your lord? Asked Frodo. I am Gildor, answered their leader, the elf who had first hailed him. Gildor Inglorian of the house of Finrod. We are exiles. Most of our kindred have long ago departed, and we too are now only tarrying here a while, ere we return across the great sea. But some of our kinsfolk dwell still in peace in Rivendell. Come now, Frodo, tell us what you are doing, for we see that there is some shadow of fear upon you. Oh, wise people, interrupted Pippin eagerly, tell us about the Black Riders. Black Riders, they said in low voices. Why are you asking about Black Riders? Because 2 black riders overtook us today, and one has done so twice. Or one has done so twice. Only a little while ago. He slipped away as you drew near. The elves did not answer at once. They spoke together softly in their own tongue. And then at length Gildor turned back to the hobbits. We will not speak of this here, he said. We think you had best come now with us. It is not our custom. But for this time, we will take you on our road. And you shall lodge with us tonight, if you will. Oh, fair folk, this is good fortune beyond my hope, said Pippin. Sam was speechless. I thank you indeed, Gildor Inglorium, said Frodo, bowing. Ellen Sila Luminen, Amontielvo. A star shines at the hour of our meeting, he added in the High Elven speech. Be careful, friends, cried Gildor, laughing. Speak no secrets. Here is a scholar of the ancient tongue. Bilbo was a good master. Hail, elf friend, he said, bowing to Frodo. Come now, with your friends, join our company. You had best walk in the middle so that you may not stray. You may be weary before we halt. Why? Where are you going? Asked Frodo. For tonight we go to the woods on the hills above Wood Hall. It is some miles, but you shall have rest at the end of it, and it will shorten your journey tomorrow. They now marched on, again in silence, and passed like shadows and faint lights. For elves, even more than hobbits, could walk when they wished without sound or footfall. Pippin soon began to feel sleepy and staggered once or twice, but each time a tall elf at his side put out his arm and saved him from a fall. Sam walked along at Frodo's side as if he was in a dream, with an expression on his face half of fear and half of astonished joy. The woods on either side became denser. The trees were now younger and thicker, and as the lane went lower, running down into the fold of the hills, there were many deep breaks of hazel on the rising slopes on either hand. At last, the elves turned aside from the path. A green ride lay almost unseen through the thickets of the night, and this they followed as it wound away back up the wooded slopes to the top of a shoulder of hills that stood out into the lower land of the river valley. Suddenly they came out of the shadow of the trees, and before them lay a wide space of grass, gray under the night. On 3 sides, the woods pressed upon it, but eastward the ground fell steeply, and the tops of dark trees growing at the bottom of the slope were below their feet. Beyond, the low land lay dim and flat under the stars. Nearer at hand, a few lights twinkled in the village of Wood Hall. The elves sat on the grass. They spoke together in soft voices. They seemed to take no further notice of the hobbits. Frodo and his companions wrapped themselves in cloaks and blankets, and drowsiness stole over them. The night grew on, and the lights in the valley went out. Pippin fell asleep, pillowed on a green hillock. Away high in the east swung Remirath, the netted stars, and slowly above the mist, red Borgil rose, glowing like a jewel of fire. Then, by some shift of air, all the mist was drawn away like a veil, and there leaned up, as he climbed over the rim of the world, the swordsman of the sky, Menel Vagor, with his shining belt. The elves all burst into song. Suddenly, under the trees, a fire sprang up with a red light. Come, said the elves to the hobbits. Come, now's the time for speech and merriment. Pippin sat up and rubbed his eyes. He shivered. There's a fire in the hall and food for hungry guests, said an elf standing before him. At the south end of the greensward there was an opening. There, a green floor ran on into the wood and formed a wide space like a hall, roofed by the boughs of trees. Their great trunks ran along like pillars down each side, and in the middle there was a wood fire blazing, and upon 3 pillars torches with lights of gold and silver, were burning steadily. The elves sat round the fire upon the grass or upon sawn rings of old tree trunks. Some went to and fro bearing cups and pouring drinks. Others brought food on heaped plates and dishes. "This is poor fare," they said to the hobbits, "for we are lodging in the greenwood, far from our hall. If ever you are guests in our home, we will treat you better." "Well, it seems to me good enough for a birthday party," said Frodo. Pippin afterwards recalled little of either food or drink, for his mind was filled with the light upon the elf faces and the sound of their voices, so various and so beautiful that he felt like he was in a waking dream. But he remembered that there was bread, surpassing the savor of a fair white loaf to one who is starving, and fruits, sweet as wild berries and richer than the tended fruits of their gardens. And he drained a cup which seemed to be filled with a fragrant draught, cool as a clear fountain, golden as a summer afternoon. Sam could never describe in words, or picture clearly to himself, what he felt or thought about that night, though it remained in his memory as one of the chief events of his life. The nearest he ever got to say was, "Well, sir, if I could grow apples like that, I would call myself a gardener." But it was the singing that went right to my heart, if you know what I mean. Frodo sat eating, drinking, and talking with delight, but his mind was chiefly on the words spoken. He knew a little of the elf speech, and he listened eagerly. Now and again he spoke to those that served him, and he thanked them in their own language. They smiled at him, and they said, laughing, "Here's a jewel among hobbits." After a while, Pippin fell fast asleep, and he was lifted up and borne away into a bower under the trees. There he was laid upon a soft bed and slept the rest of the night away. Sam refused to leave his master. When Pippin had gone, he came and sat curled up at Frodo's feet, where at last he nodded and closed his eyes. Frodo remained long awake, talking with Gildor. They spoke of many things, old and new, and Frodo questioned Gildor much about the happenings in the wide world outside the Shire. The tidings were mostly sad and ominous. Gathering darkness, wars of men, flights of the elves, the flight of the elves. At last, Frodo asked the question that was nearest to his heart. "Tell me, Gildor, have you ever seen Bilbo since he left us?" Gildor smiled. "Yes," he answered, "twice. He said farewell to us on this very spot, but I saw him once again far from here." Then he would say no more about Bilbo, and Frodo fell silent. "You do not ask me or tell me much that concerns yourself, Frodo," said Gildor, "but I already know a little. I can read more in your face and in the thought behind your questions. You are leaving the Shire, and yet you doubt that you will find what you seek, or accomplish what you intend, or that you will ever return. Is that not so?" "It is," said Frodo. "But I thought my going was a secret known only to Gandalf and my faithful Sam." He looked down at Sam, who was snoring gently. "Your secret will not reach the enemy from us," said Gildor. "The enemy?" said Frodo. "Then you know why I'm leaving the Shire." "Oh, I don't know for what reason the enemy is pursuing you," answered Gildor, "but I perceive that he is, strange indeed though that seems to me. I warn you, peril is now both before you and behind you, and upon either side." "You mean the riders? I feared that they were servants of the enemy. What are the Black Riders?" "Has Gandalf told you nothing?" "Well, nothing about such creatures." "Well, then I think it's not for me to say more, lest terror should keep you from your journey. For it seems to me that you have set out only just in time, if indeed you are in time. You must now make haste, and neither stay nor turn back. The Shire is no longer any protection for you." "I cannot imagine what information could be so or more terrifying than your hints and your warnings, exclaimed Frodo. I knew the danger lay ahead, of course, but I did not expect to meet it in our own shire. Can a hobbit walk from the water to the river in peace? But it is not your own shire, said Gildor. Others dwelt here, before hobbits were. Others will dwell here again, when hobbits are no more. The wide world is all about you. You can fence yourselves in, but you cannot ever fence it out. Oh, I know. Yet it has always seemed so safe and familiar. What can I do now? My plan was to leave the Shire secretly and make my way to Rivendell. But now my footsteps are dogged, before I even get to Buckland. Well, I think you should still follow your plan, said Gildor. And I do not think that the road would prove too hard for your courage. But if you desire clearer counsel, you should ask Gandalf. I do not know the reason for your flight. Therefore, I do not know by what means your pursuers will assail you. These things Gandalf must know. I suppose you will see him before you leave the Shire? Oh, I hope so. And that's another thing that makes me anxious. I have been expecting Gandalf many days. He was to have come to Hobbiton at least 2 nights ago, but he never appeared. Now I'm wondering what could have happened. Should I wait for him? Gildor was silent for a moment. I do not like this news, he said at last. That Gandalf should be late? That does not bode well. But it is said, do not meddle in the affairs of wizards, for they are subtle and quick to anger. The choice is yours to go or wait. It is also said, answered Frodo, go not to the elves for counsel, for they will say both no and yes. Is it indeed? Laughed Gildor. Well, elves seldom give unguarded advice, for advice is a dangerous gift, even from the wise to the wise, and all courses may run ill. But what would you? You have not told me all concerning yourself. How then shall I choose better than you? But if you demand advice, I will, for friendship's sake, give it. I think you should go now at once, without delay. And if Gandalf does not come before you set out, then I also advise this. Do not go alone. Take such friends as are trusty and willing. Now you should be grateful, for I did not give this counsel gladly. The elves have their own labors and their own sorrows, and they are little concerned with the ways of hobbits or any other creature upon this earth. Our paths cross there seldom, by chance or purpose. In this meeting, there may be more than chance, but the purpose is not clear to me, and I fear to say too much. Well, I am deeply grateful, said Frodo, but I wish you would tell me plainly what the Black Riders are. If I take your advice, I may not see Gandalf for a long while, and I ought to know what the danger is that pursues me. Is it not enough to know that they are servants of the enemy? Answered Gildor. Flee them. Speak no words to them. They are deadly. Ask no more of me. But my heart forebodes that ere all is ended, you, Frodo, son of Drogo, will know more of these fell things than Gildor and Glorion. May Elbereth protect you. Where shall I find courage? Asked Frodo. That is what I chiefly need. Courage is found in unlikely places, said Gildor. Be of good hope. Sleep now. In the morning we shall have gone, but we will send our messages through the lands. The wandering companies shall know of your journey, and those that have power for good shall be on the watch. I name you Elf Friend, and may the stars shine upon the end of your road. Seldom have we had such delight in strangers, and it is fair to hear the words of the ancient speech on the lips of other wanderers in this world. Frodo felt sleep coming upon him, even as Gildor finished speaking. I will sleep now, he said. And as the elf led him to a bower beside Pippin, he threw himself upon a bed and fell at once into a dreamless slumber.